Hello, welcome back to episode 5 of reading the entire Magic the Gathering comprehensive rule books. This is part 5, turn structure. Uh, well, I'm sure everyone knows of the classic untap upkeep draw and, main phase, combat, end phase, but let's look at the details of that today. Let's go. 500, general. 501. A turn consists of 5 phases in this order: beginning, pre-combat main, combat, post-combat main, and ending. Each of these phases take place every turn, even if nothing happens during the phase. The beginning, combat, and ending phases are further broken down into steps, which proceed in order. 500.2. A phase or step in which players receive priority ends when the stack is empty and all players pass in succession. Simply having the stack become empty doesn't cause such a phase or step to end. All players have to pass in succession with the stack empty. Because of this, each player gets a chance to add new things to the stack before that phase or step ends. 500.3. A step in which no players receive priority ends when all specified actions that take place during that step are completed. The only such steps are the Untap Step, see Rule 502, and certain cleanup steps, see Rule 514. 500.4. When a step or phase ends, any unused mana left in a player's mana pool empties. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 500.5. When a phase or step ends, any effects scheduled to last until end of that phase or step expire. When a phase or step begins, any effects scheduled to last until that phase or step expire. Effects that last until end of combat expire at the end of the combat phase, not at the beginning of the end of combat step. Effects that last until end of turn are subject to special rules. See Rule 514.2. 500.6. When a phase or step begins, any abilities that trigger at the beginning of that phase or step trigger. They are put on the stack the next time a player would receive priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 500.7. Some effects can give a player extra turns. They do this by adding the turns directly after the specified turn. If a player is given multiple extra turns, the extra turns are added one at a time. If multiple players are given extra turns, the extra turns are added one at a time, in AppNap order. See Rule 101.4. The most recently created turn will be taken first. 500.8. Some effects can add phases to a turn. They do this by adding the phases directly after the specified phase. If multiple extra phases are created after the same phase, the most recently created phase will occur first. 500.9. Some effects can add steps to a phase. They do this by adding the steps directly after a specified step or directly before a specified step. If multiple extra steps are created after the same step, the most recently created step will occur first. 500.10. Some effects add a step after a particular phase. In that case, that effect first creates the phase which normally contains that step directly after the specified phase. Any other steps that phase would normally have are skipped. See Rule 500.11. For example, Ubeka Splitter of Seconds says, in part, whenever Ubeka deals combat damage to a player, you get that many additional upkeep steps after this phase. After that ability resolves, its controller adds that many beginning phases after this phase. Those new beginning phases have only an upkeep step. The untap steps and draw steps of those phases are skipped. 500.10a. If an effect that says you get an additional step or phase would add a step or phase to a turn other than its controllers, no steps or phases are added. 500.11. Some effects can cause a step, phase, or turn to be skipped. To skip a step, phase, or turn is to proceed past it as though it didn't exist. See Rule 614.10. 500.12. No game events can occur between steps, phases, or turns. 501. Beginning phase. 501.1. The beginning phase consists of 3 steps in this order: untap, upkeep, and draw. 502. Untap step. 502.1. First, all phased-in permanents with phasing that the active player controls phases out, and all phased-out permanents that the active player controlled when they phased out phase in. This all happens simultaneously. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. See Rule 702.26, Phasing. 502.2. Second, if it's day and the previous turn's active player didn't cast any spells during that turn, it becomes night. If it's night and the previous turn's active player casts 2 or more spells during that turn, it becomes day. If it's neither day nor night, this check doesn't happen and it remains neither. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. See Rule 729, Day and Night. 502.28. Multiplayer games using the shared team turns option use a modified rule. If it's day and no player on the previous turn's active team casts a spell during that turn, it becomes night. If it's night and any player on the previous turn's active team casts 2 or more spells during the previous turn, it becomes day. If it's neither day nor night, this check doesn't happen and it remains in neither. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 502.3. Third, the active player determines which permanents they control will untap. Then they untap them all simultaneously. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. Normally, all of a player's permanents untap, but effects can keep one or more of a player's permanents from untapping. 502.4. No players receive priority during the Untap step, so no spells can be cast or resolve, and no abilities can be activated or resolved. Any ability that triggers during this step will be held until the next time a player would receive priority, which is usually during the Upkeep step. See Rule 503, Upkeep Step. 503, Upkeep Step. 503.1. The Upkeep step has no turn-based actions. Once it begins, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 503.1a. Any abilities that trigger during the untap step and any abilities that trigger at the beginning of the upkeep step are put onto the stack before the active player gets priority. The order in which they triggered doesn't matter. See Rule 603, Handling Triggered Abilities. 503.2. If a spell states that it may be cast only after a player's upkeep step, and the turn has multiple upkeep steps, that spell may be cast anytime after the first upkeep step ends. 504, Draw Step. 504.1. First, the active player draws a card. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 504.2. Second, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 505. Main Phase. 505.1. There are 2 main phases in a turn. In each turn, the first main phase, also known as the pre-combat main phase, and the second main phase, also known as the post-combat main phase, are separated by the combat phase. See Rule 506, Combat Phase. The pre-combat and post-combat main phases are individually and collectively known as the main phase. 505.18. Only the first main phase of the turn is a pre-combat main phase. All other main phases are post-combat main phases. This includes the second main phase of a turn in which the combat phase has been skipped. It is also true of a turn in which an effect has caused an additional combat phase and an additional main phase to be created. 505.1b. In card text, phrases such as first main phase, second main phase, and so on count the number of main phases that have occurred only in the current turn unless that text specifies otherwise. 505.2. The main phase has no steps, so a main phase ends when all players pass in succession while the stack is empty. See Rule 500.2. 505.3. First, but only if the players are playing an archenemy game, see Rule 904, the active player is the archenemy, and it's the active player's pre-combat main phase, the active player sets the top card of their scheme deck in motion. See Rule 701.25. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 505.4. Second, if the active player controls 1 or more saga enchantments and it's the active player's pre-combat main phase, the active player puts a lore counter on each saga they control. See Rule 714, Saga Cards. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 505.5. Third, if the active player controls 1 or more attractions and it's the active player's pre-combat main phase, the active player rolls to visit their attractions. See Rule 701.49, Roll to visit your attractions. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 505.6. Fourth, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 505.6a. The main phase is the only phase in which a player can normally cast artifact, creature, enchantment, planeswalker, and sorcery spells. The active player may cast those spells. 505.6. During either main phase, the active player may play 1 land from their hand if the stack is empty, if the player has priority, and if they haven't played a land this turn, unless an effect states the player may play additional lands. This action doesn't use the stack. Neither the land nor the action of playing the land is a spell or ability, so it can't be countered, and players can't respond to it with instance and activated abilities. See Rule 305, Lands. 506, Combat Phase. 506.1. The combat phase has 5 steps, which proceed in order: beginning of combat, declare attackers, declare blockers, combat damage, and end of combat. The declare blockers and combat damage steps are skipped if no creatures are declared as attackers or put onto the battlefield attacking. See Rule 508.8. There are 2 combat damage steps if any attacking or blocking creatures has first strike, see Rule 702.7, or double strike, see Rule 702.4. 506.2. During the combat phase, the active player is the attacking player. Creatures that player controls may attack. During the combat phase of a 2-player game, the non-active player is the defending player. That player, planeswalkers they control, and battles they protect may be attacked. 506.2a. During the combat phase of a multiplayer game, there may be 1 or more defending players, depending on the variant being played and the options chosen for it. Unless all the attacking players or opponents automatically become defending players during the combat phase, the attacking player chooses one of their opponents as a turn-based action during the beginning of combat step. Note that the choice may be dictated by the variant being played or the options chosen for it. The player becomes the defending player. See Rule 802, Attack Multiple Players option, Rule 803, Attack Left and Right options, and Rule 809, Emperor variant. 506.2b. In multiplayer games using the shared team turns option, the active player is the attacking team, and the non-active team is the defending team. See Rule 805, Shared Team Turns option. 506.3. Only a creature can attack or block. Only a player, a planeswalker, or a battle can be attacked. 506.3a. If an effect would put a non-creature permanent onto the battlefield attacking or blocking, the permanent does enter the battlefield, but it's never considered to be an attacking or blocking permanent. 506.3b. If an effect would put a creature onto the battlefield attacking under the control of any player except an attacking player, that creature does enter the battlefield, but is never considered to be an attacking creature. 506.3c. If an effect would put a creature onto the battlefield attacking either a player not in the game or a permanent that's no longer on the battlefield or isn't either a planeswalker or a battle, that creature does enter the battlefield, but is never considered to be an attacking creature. See Rule 508.4a. 506.3d. If an effect would put a creature onto the battlefield blocking, but the creature it would block isn't attacking the entering creature's controller, a planeswalker that player controls, or a battle that player protects, that creature does enter the battlefield, but is never considered to be a blocking creature. 506.3e. If an effect would put a creature that's also a battle onto the battlefield attacking or blocking, that permanent enters the battlefield, but it is never considered to be an attacking or blocking creature. 506.3 F. If a resolving spell or ability would cause a battle to become an attacking or blocking creature, that part of the effect does nothing. 506.4. A permanent is removed from combat if it leaves the battlefield, if its controller changes, if it phases out, if an effect specifically removes it from combat, if it's planeswalker that's being attacked or stops being a planeswalker, if it's a battle that's being attacked and stops being a battle, or if it's an attacking or blocking creature that regenerates, see Rule 701.15, stops being a creature or becomes a battle. A creature that's removed from combat stops being an attacking, blocking, blocked, and or unblocked creature. A planeswalker or battle that's removed from combat stops being attacked. 506.4a. Once a creature has been declared as an attacking or blocking creature, spells or abilities that would have kept that creature from attacking or blocking don't remove the creature from combat. 506.4b. Tapping or untapping a creature that's already been declared as an attacker or blocker doesn't remove it from combat and doesn't prevent its combat damage. 506.4c. If a creature is attacking a planeswalker or battle, removing that planeswalker or battle from combat doesn't remove that creature from combat. It continues to be an attacking creature, although it is not attacking any player, planeswalker, or battle. It may be blocked. If it is unblocked, it will deal no combat damage. 506.4d. A permanent that's both a blocking creature and a planeswalker that's being attacked is removed from combat if it stops being both a creature and a planeswalker. If it stops being one of those card types but continues to be the other, it continues to be either a blocking creature or a planeswalker that's being attacked, whichever is appropriate. 506.4e. A permanent that's being attacked that is both a planeswalker and a battle is removed from combat if it stops being both a planeswalker and a battle. If it stops being a battle but is still a planeswalker, it is removed from combat only if it is not controlled by its protector. If it stops being a planeswalker but is still a battle, it is not removed from combat. It continues to be a battle that's being attacked. 506.5. A creature attacks alone if it's the only creature declared as an attacker during the declare attacker step. A creature is attacking alone if it's attacking but no other creatures are. A creature blocks alone if it's the only creature declared as a blocker during the declare blocker step. A creature is blocking alone if it's blocking but no other creatures are. 506.6. Some abilities check to see whether or not a creature had to attack. during a particular combat phase. A creature had to attack if one or more effects were requiring that creature to attack at the time attackers were declared in that combat. A creature did not have to attack if there were no such effects that required it to attack, even if there were no other legal attacks that could have been declared. See Rule 508. 506.7. Some spells state that they may be cast only before/after a particular point in the combat phase, in which that point may be attackers are declared, blockers are declared, the combat damage step, the end of combat step, the combat phase, or combat. 506.78. A spell that states it may be cast only before or after attackers are declared is referring to the turn-based action of declaring attackers. It may be cast only before or after the declare attacker step begins, regardless of whether any attackers are actually declared. See Rule 508. 506.7b. A spell that states it may be cast only before or after blockers are declared is referring to the turn-based action of declaring blockers. It may be cast only before or after a declare blocker step begins, regardless of whether any blockers are actually declared. See Rule 509. 506.7c. Some spells state that they may be only cast during combat or during a certain player's combat phase, in addition to the criteria described in Rule 506.7. If a turn has multiple combat phases, such spells may be cast at an appropriate time during any of them. 506.7d. Some spells state that they may be cast only before or after a particular point in the combat phase, but don't meet the additional criteria described in Rule 506.7c. If a turn has multiple combat phases, such spells may be cast that turn only before or after the stated point of the first combat phase. 506.7e. If a spell states that it may be cast only before a particular point in the combat phase, but the stated point doesn't exist within the relevant combat phase that because the declare blocker step and the combat damage step are skipped, see Rule 508.8, then the spell may be cast only before the declares attacker step ends. If the stated point doesn't exist because the relevant combat phase has been skipped, then the spell may be cast only before the pre-combat main phase ends. 506.7f. If a spell states that it may be cast only during combat after blockers are declared, but the declare blocker step is skipped at combat phase, see Rule 508.8, then the spell may not be cast during that combat phase. 506.7g. Rules 506.7 and 506.7a to f apply to abilities that state that they may be activated only at certain times with respect to combat, just as they apply to spells that state that they may be cast only at certain times with respect to combat. 507. Beginning of combat phase. 507.1. First, if the game being played is a multiplayer game in which the active player's opponents don't all automatically become defending players, the active player chooses one of their opponents. That player becomes the defending player. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. See Rule 506.2. 507.2. Second, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 508. Declare attacker's step. 508.1. First, the active player declares attackers. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. To declare attackers, the active player follows the steps below in order. If at any point during the declaration of attackers, the active player is unable to comply with any of the steps listed below, the declaration is illegal. The game returns to the moment before the declaration. See Rule 731, Handling Illegal Actions. 508.1a. The active player chooses which creature that they control, if any, will attack. The chosen creatures must be untapped, they can't also be battles, and each one must either have haste or have been controlled by the active player continuously since the turn began. 508.1b. If the defending player controls any planeswalkers, is the protector of any battles, or the game allows the active player to attack multiple other players, the active player announces which player, planeswalker, or battle each of the chosen creatures is attacking. 508.1c. The active player checks each creature they control to see whether it's affected by any restrictions, effects that say a creature can't attack, or that it can't attack unless some condition is met. If any restrictions are being disobeyed, the declaration of attackers is illegal. For example, a player controls two creatures, each with a restriction that states this creature can't attack alone. It's legal to declare both as attackers. 508.1d. The active player checks each creature they control to see whether it's affected by any requirements, effects that say a creature attacks if able, or that attacks if some condition is met. If the number of requirements that are being obeyed is fewer than the maximum possible number of requirements that could be obeyed without disobeying any restrictions, the declaration of attackers is illegal. If a creature can't attack unless a player pays a cost, the player is not required to pay that cost, even if attacking with that creature would increase the number of requirements being obeyed. If a requirement says that says a creature attacks if able during a certain turn refers to a turn with multiple combat phases. The creature attacks if able during each declare attacker step in that turn. For example, a player controls two creatures, one that attacks if able and one with no abilities. An effect states no more than one creature can attack each turn. The only legal attack is for just the creature that attacks if able to attack. It's illegal to attack with the other creature, attack with both, or attack with neither. 508.1e. If any of the chosen creatures have banding or a band with other ability, the active player announces which creatures, if any, are banded with which. See Rule 702.22 Banding. 508.1f. The active player taps the chosen creatures. Tapping a creature when it's declared as an attacker isn't a cost. Attacking simply causes creatures to become tapped. 508.1g. If there are any optional costs to attack with chosen creatures, expressed as costs a player may pay as a creature attacks, the active player chooses which, if any, they will pay. 508.1h. If any of the chosen creatures require paying costs to attack, or if any optional costs to attack were chosen, the active player determines the total cost to attack. Costs may include paying mana, tapping permanents, sacrificing permanents, discarding cards, and so on. Once the total cost is determined, it becomes locked in. If effects would change the total cost after this time, ignore this change. 508.1i. If any of the costs require mana, the active player then has a chance to activate mana abilities. See Rule 605, Mana Abilities. 508.1j. Once the player has enough mana in their mana pool, they pay all costs in any order. Partial payments are not allowed. 508.1k. Each chosen creature still controlled by the active player becomes an attacking creature. It remains an attacking creature until it's removed from combat or the combat phase ends, whichever comes first. See Rule 506.4. 508.1m. Any abilities that trigger on attackers being declared, trigger. 508.2. Second, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 508.28. Abilities that trigger on a creature attacking trigger only at the point that the creature is declared as an attacker. They will not trigger if a creature attacks and then the creature's characteristics change to match the ability's trigger condition. For example, a permanent has the ability, whenever a green creature attacks, destroy that creature at end of combat. If a blue creature attacks and is later turned green, the ability will not trigger. 508.2b. Any abilities that triggered on attackers being declared or that triggered during the process described in Rules 508.1 are put onto the stack before the active player gets priority. The order in which they triggered doesn't matter. See Rule 603, Handling Triggered Abilities. 508.3. Triggered abilities that trigger on attackers being declared may have different trigger conditions. 508.3a. An ability that reads, whenever a creature attacks, triggers if that creature is declared as an attacker. Similarly, whenever a creature attacks a player, planeswalker, or battle, triggers if that creature is declared as an attacker attacking that player or permanent. Such abilities won't trigger if a creature is put onto the battlefield attacking. 508.3b. An ability that reads, whenever a player, planeswalker, or battle is attacked, triggers if one or more creatures are declared as attackers attacking that player or permanent. It won't trigger if a creature is put onto the battlefield attacking that player or permanent. 508.3c. An ability that reads, whenever a player attacks with a creature, triggers if a creature that player controls is declared as an attacker. 508.3d. An ability that reads, whenever a player attacks, triggers if one or more creatures that player controls are declared as attackers. 508.3e. An ability that reads, whenever a player attacks another player, triggers if one or more creatures the first player controls are declared as attackers attacking the second player. It won't trigger if a creature is put onto the battlefield attacking, or if a creature attacks a planeswalker or battle. 508.3f. An ability that reads, whenever a creature attacks and isn't blocked, triggers during the declare blockers step, not the declare attackers step. See Rule 509.3g. 508.4. If a creature is put onto the battlefield attacking, its controller chooses which defending player, planeswalker a defending player controls, or battle a defending player protects, is attacking as it enters the battlefield, unless the effect that puts it onto the battlefield specifies what it's attacking. Similarly, if an effect states that a creature is attacking, its controller chooses which defending player, planeswalker defending player controls, or battle a defending player protects its attacking, unless the effect has already specified. Such creatures are attacking, but for the purposes of triggered events and effects, they never attacked. 508.4a. If the effect that puts a creature onto the battlefield attacking specifies it's attacking a certain player, and that player is no longer in the game when the effect resolves, the creature is put onto the battlefield but is never considered an attacking creature. The same is true if the effect specifies a creature is put onto the battlefield attacking a planeswalker or battle, and when the effect resolves, the permanent is no longer on the battlefield, is no longer a planeswalker or battle, is a planeswalker that is no longer controlled by the defending player, or is a battle that is no longer protected by a defending player. 508.4b. If the effect that states a creature is attacking specifies it's attacking a certain player, and that player is no longer in the game when the effect resolves, the creature doesn't become an attacking creature. The same is true if the effect specifies a creature is attacking a planeswalker or battle, and when the effect resolves, the permanent is no longer on the battlefield, is no longer a planeswalker or battle, is a planeswalker that is no longer controlled by a defending player, or is a battle that is no longer protected by a defending player. 508.4c. A creature that's put onto the battlefield attacking, or that is stated to be attacking, isn't affected by requirements or restrictions that apply to the declaration of attackers. 508.5. If an ability of an attacking creature refers to a defending player, or a spell or ability refers to both an attacking creature, and a defending player, then unless otherwise specified, the defending player it's referring to is the player that creature is attacking, the controller of the planeswalker that creature is attacking, or the protector of the battle that creature is attacking. If that creature is no longer attacking, the defending player is referring to is the player that creature was attacking before it was removed from combat. The controller of the planeswalker that creature was attacking before it was removed from combat, or the protector of the battle that creature was attacking before it was removed from combat. 508.5a. In a multiplayer game, any rule, object, or effect that refers to a defending player refers to one specific defending player, not all of the defending players. If a spell or ability could apply to multiple attacking creatures, the appropriate defending player is individually determined for each of those attacking creatures. If there are multiple defending players that could be chosen, the controller of the spell or ability chooses one. 508.6. A player is attacking a player if the first player controls a creature that is attacking the second player. A player has attacked the player if the first player declared one or more creatures as attackers attacking the second player. 508.7. Some cards allow a player to reselect which player, planeswalker, or battle a creature is attacking. 508.78. The attacking creature isn't removed from combat and it isn't considered to have attacked a second time. The creature is attacking the reselected player or permanent, but is still considered to have attacked the player or permanent chosen as it was declared as an attacker. 508.7b. While reselecting which player, planeswalker, or battle-like creature is attacking, that creature isn't affected by requirements or restrictions that apply to the declaration of attackers. 508.7c. The reselected player, planeswalker, or battle must be an opponent of the attacking creature's controller, a planeswalker controlled by an opponent of the attacking creature's controller, or a battle protected by an opponent of the attacking creature's controller. 508.7d. In a multiplayer game not using the attack multiple players option, see Rule 802, the reselected player, planeswalker, or battle must be the chosen defending player, a planeswalker controlled by that player, or a battle protected by that player. 508.7e. In a multiplayer game using the limited range of influence option, see Rule 801, the reselected player, planeswalker, or battle must be within the range of influence of the attacking creature's controller. In the case of a battle, the battle's protector must also be within the range of influence in the attacking creature's controller. 508.8. If no creatures are declared as attackers or put into the battlefield attacking, skip the declare blockers and combat damage steps. 509. Declare blockers step. 509.1. First, the defending player declares blockers. This turn-based action doesn't use a stack. To declare attackers, the defending player follows the steps below, in order. If at any point during the declaration of blockers, the defending player is unable to comply with any of the steps listed below, the declaration is illegal. The game returns to the moment before the declaration. See Rule 731, Handling Illegal Actions. 509.18. The defending player chooses which creature they control, if any, will block. The chosen creatures must be untapped and they can't also be battles. For each of the chosen creatures, the defending player chooses one creature for it to block that's attacking that player, a planeswalker they control, or a battle they protect. 509.1b. The defending player checks each creature they control to see whether it's affected by any restrictions, effects that say a creature can't block, or that it can't be blocked unless some condition is met. If any restrictions are being disobeyed, the declaration of blockers is illegal. A restriction may be created by an evasion ability, a static ability an attacking creature has that restricts what can block it. If an attacking creature gains or loses an evasion ability after a legal block has been declared, it doesn't affect that block. Different evasion abilities are cumulative. For example, an attacking creature with flying and shadow can't be blocked by a creature with flying, but without shadow. 509.1c. The defending player checks each creature they control to see whether it's affected by any requirements, effects that say a creature must block, or that it must block if some condition is met. If the number of requirements that are being obeyed is fewer than the maximum number of requirements that could be obeyed without disobeying any restrictions, the declaration of its blockers is illegal. If a creature can't block unless a player pays a cost, that player is not required to pay that cost, even if blocking with that creature would increase the number of requirements being obeyed. If a requirement that says a creature blocks if able during a certain turn refers to a turn with multiple combat phases, the creature blocks if able during each declared blocker step in that turn. For example, a player controls one creature that blocks if able, and another creature with no abilities. If a creature with menace attacks that player, the player must block with both creatures. Having only the first creature blocked violates the restriction created by menace. The attacking creature can't be blocked except by two or more creatures. Having only the second creature blocked violates both the menace restriction and the first creature's blocking requirements. Having neither creature blocked fulfills the restriction but not the requirement. 509.1d. If any of the chosen creatures require paying costs to block, the defending player determines the total cost to block. Costs may include paying mana, tapping permanents, sacrificing permanents, discarding cards, and so on. Once the total cost is determined, it becomes locked in. If effects would change the total cost after this time, ignore this change. 509.1e. If any of the costs require mana, the defending player then has a chance to activate mana abilities. See Rule 605, Mana Abilities. 509.1f. Once the player has enough mana in their mana pool, they pay all costs in any order. Partial payments are not allowed. 509.1g. Each chosen creature still controlled by the defending player becomes a blocking creature. Each one is blocking the attacking creature chosen for it. It remains a blocking creature until it's removed from combat or the combat phase ends, whichever comes first. See Rule 506.4. 509.1h. An attacking creature with one or more creatures declared as blockers for it becomes a blocked creature. One with no creatures declared as blockers for it becomes an unblocked creature. This remains unchanged until the creature is removed from combat. An effect says that it becomes blocked or unblocked, or the combat phase ends, whichever comes first. A creature remains blocked even if all the creatures blocking it are removed from combat. 509.1i. Any abilities that trigger on blockers being declared trigger. See Rule 509.2a for more information. 509.2. Second, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 509.2a. Any abilities that triggered on blockers being declared or that triggered during the process described in Rule 509.1 are put into the stack before the active player gets priority. The order in which they triggered doesn't matter. See Rule 603, Handling Triggered Abilities. 509.3. Triggered abilities that trigger on blockers being declared may have different trigger conditions. 509.3a. An ability that reads, whenever a creature blocks, generally triggers only once each combat for that creature, even if it blocks multiple creatures. It triggers if the creature is declared as a blocker. It also triggers if that creature becomes a blocker as a result of an effect, but only if it wasn't a blocking creature at that time. See Rule 509.1g. It won't trigger if the creature is put onto the battlefield blocking. 509.3b. An ability that reads, whenever a creature blocks a creature, triggers once for each attacking creature a creature with the ability blocks. It triggers if the creature is declared as a blocker. It will also trigger if an effect causes that creature to block an attacking creature, but only if it wasn't already blocking that attacking creature at that time. It won't trigger if the creature is put onto the battlefield blocking. 509.3c. An ability that reads, whenever a creature becomes blocked, generally triggers only once each combat for that creature, even if it's blocked by multiple creatures. It will trigger if the creature becomes blocked by at least one creature declared as a blocker. It will also trigger if that creature becomes blocked by an effect or by a creature that's put onto the battlefield as a blocker, but only if the attacking creature was an unblocked creature at that time. See Rule 509.1h. 509.3d. An ability that reads, whenever a creature becomes blocked by a creature, triggers once for each creature that blocks the specified creature. It triggers if a creature is declared as a blocker for the attacking creature. It will also trigger if an effect causes a creature to block the attacking creature, but only if it wasn't already blocking that attacking creature at that time. In addition, it will trigger if a creature is put onto the battlefield blocking that creature. It won't trigger if the creature becomes blocked by an effect rather than a creature. 509.3. If an ability triggers when a creature blocks or becomes blocked by a particular number of creatures, the ability triggers if the creature blocks or is blocked by that many creatures when blockers are declared. Effects that add or remove blockers can also cause such abilities to trigger. This applies to abilities that trigger on a creature blocking or being blocked by at least a certain number of creatures as well. 509.3f. If an ability triggers when a creature with certain characteristics blocks, it will trigger only if that creature has those characteristics at the point of at the point blockers are declared, or at the point an effect causes it to block. If an ability triggers when a creature with certain characteristics becomes blocked, it will trigger only if the creature has those characteristics at the point it becomes a blocked creature. If an ability triggers when a creature becomes blocked by a creature with certain characteristics, it will trigger only if the latter creature has those characteristics at the point it becomes a blocking creature. None of those abilities will trigger if the relevant creature's characteristics change to match the ability's trigger condition later on. For example, a creature has the ability, whenever this creature becomes blocked by a white creature, destroy that creature at end of combat. If the creature becomes blocked by a black creature that is later turned white, the ability will not trigger. 509.3G. An ability that reads, whenever a creature attacks and isn't blocked, triggers if no creatures are declared as blockers for that creature. It will trigger even if the creature was never declared as an attacker. For example, if it entered the battlefield attacking. It won't trigger if the attacking creature is blocked and then all its blockers are removed from combat. 509.4. If a creature is put onto the battlefield blocking, its controller chooses which attacking creature it's blocking as it enters the battlefield, unless the effect that puts it onto the battlefield specifies what it's blocking. A creature put onto the battlefield this way is blocking, but for the purposes of triggered events and effects, it never blocked. 509.4a. If the effect that puts a creature onto the battlefield blocking specifies as blocking a certain creature and that creature is no longer attacking, the creature is put onto the battlefield but is never considered a blocking creature. The same is true if the controller of the creature that's put onto the battlefield blocking isn't a defending player for the specified attacking creature. 509.4b. A creature that's put into the battlefield blocking isn't affected by requirements or restrictions that apply to the declaration of blockers. 510. Combat damage step. 510.1. First, the active player announces how each attacking creature assigns its combat damage. Then the defending player announces how each blocking creature assigns its combat damage. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. The player assigns a creature's combat damage according to the following rules. 510.1a. Each attacking creature and each blocking creature assigns combat damage equal to its power. Creatures that will assign 0 or less damage this way don't assign combat damage at all. 510.1b. An unblocked creature assigns its combat damage to the player, planeswalker, or battle it's attacking. If it isn't currently attacking anything, if for example it was attacking a planeswalker that has left the battlefield, it assigns no combat damage. 510.1c. A blocked creature assigns its combat damage to the creatures blocking it. If no creatures are currently blocking it, if for example they were destroyed or removed from combat, it assigns no combat damage. If exactly one creature is blocking it, it assigns all its combat damage to that creature. If two or more creatures are blocking it, it assigns its combat damage to those creatures divided as its controller chooses among them. For example, an attacking Elvish Regrower, a 4/3 creature, is blocked by a Vampire Spawn, a 2/3 creature, and a Helpful Hunter, a 1/1 creature. The Elvish Regrower's controller can assign all 4 damage to the Hunter, 1 damage to the Spawn and 3 damage to the Hunter, 2 damage to each creature, 3 damage to the Spawn and 1 to the Hunter, or all 4 damage to the Spawn. 510.1d. A blocking creature assigns combat damage to the creatures it's blocking. If it isn't currently blocking any creatures, if for example they were destroyed or removed from combat, it assigns no combat damage. If it's blocking exactly one creature, it assigns all its combat damage to that creature. If it's blocking 2 or more creatures, it assigns its combat damage divided as its controller chooses among them. 510.1e. Once a player has assigned combat damage from each attacking or blocking creature they control, the total damage assignment, not solely the damage assignment of any individual attacking or blocking creature, is checked to see if it complies with the above rules. If it doesn't, the combat damage assignment is illegal. The game returns to the moment before the player begins to assign combat damage. See Rule 731, Handling Illegal Actions. 510.2. Second, all combat damage that's being assigned is dealt simultaneously. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. No player has a chance to cast spells or activate abilities between the time combat damage is assigned and the time it's dealt. Some of you may remember this was recently changed in Foundations, because before this you did have a chance to respond with spells and abilities after damage was distributed, but before it was applied. Anyways, continuing. 510.3. Third, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 510.3a. Any abilities that triggered on damage being dealt or while state-based actions are performed afterward are put onto the stack before the active player gets priority. The order in which they triggered doesn't matter. See Rule 603, Handling Triggered Abilities. 510.4. If at least one attacking or blocking creature has first strike, see Rule 702.7, or double strike, see Rule 702.4 as the combat damage step begins. The only creatures that assign combat damage in that step are those with first strike or double strike. After that step, instead of proceeding to the end of combat step, the phase gets a second combat damage step. The only creatures that assigned combat damage in that step are the remaining attackers and blockers that had neither first strike nor double strike as the first combat damage step began, as well as the remaining attackers and blockers that currently have double strike. After that step, the phase proceeds to the end of combat step. 511. End of combat step. 511.1. The end of combat step has no turn-based actions. Once it begins, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 511.2. Abilities that trigger at end of combat trigger as the end of combat phase and the end of combat step begins. Effects that last until end of combat expire at the end of the combat phase. 511.3. As soon as the end of combat step ends, all creatures, battles, and planeswalkers are removed from combat. After the end of combat step ends, the combat phase is over and the post-combat main phase begins. See Rule 505. 512. Ending phase. 512.1. The ending phase consists of two steps, end and cleanup. 513. End step. 513.1. The end step has no turn-based actions. Once it begins, the active player gets priority. See Rule 117, Timing and Priority. 513.1a. Previously, abilities that triggered at the beginning of the end step were printed with the trigger condition at end of turn. Cards that were printed with that text have received an errata in the Oracle card reference to say at the beginning of the end step, or at the beginning of the next end step. 513.2. If a permanent with an ability that triggers at the beginning of the end step enters the battlefield during this step, that ability won't trigger until the next turn's end step. Likewise, if a delayed triggered ability that triggers at the beginning of the next end step is created during this step, that ability won't trigger until the next turn's end step. In other words, the step doesn't back up, so those abilities can go on the stack. This rule applies only to triggered abilities. It doesn't apply to continuous effects whose duration say until end of turn or this turn. See Rule 514, Cleanup Step. 514, Cleanup Step. 514.1. First, if the active player's hand contains more cards than their maximum hand size, normally 7, they discard enough cards to reduce their hand size to that number. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 514.2. Second, the following actions happen simultaneously. All damage marked on permanents, including phased out permanents, is removed, and all until end of turn, and this turn effects end. This turn-based action doesn't use the stack. 514.3. Normally, no player receives priority during the cleanup step, so no spells can be cast and no abilities can be activated. However, this rule is subject to the following exception. 514.38. At this point, the game checks to see if any state-based actions would be performed and or any triggered abilities are waiting to be put into the stack, including those that trigger at the beginning of the next cleanup step. If so, those state-based actions are performed, then those triggered abilities are put into the stack, then the active player gets priority. Players may cast spells and activate abilities. Once the stack is empty and all players pass in succession, another cleanup step begins. Another short one for today. I will say I did look forward to 6 and 7, and I might have to split those into 2 each because these are like the meat of the book. Like we are what, page 87, page 87, yeah, up to 5. I'm pretty sure 6 and 7 each take up like 100 page each, so I'll just have to go see about that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.